It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the small, quiet neighborhood where Ms. Linda lived. At 72 years old, she was used to walking to the local grocery store every week. The air was warm, and the sound of birds chirping filled the streets. Ms. Linda had always enjoyed these walks, the peacefulness of her neighborhood giving her a sense of comfort. Today was no different. She had just finished shopping, her bags filled with fresh fruits, vegetables, and some bread for the week. As she walked down the sidewalk, a sense of calm washed over her. But little did she know, this afternoon would change everything for her. As she approached the corner of the street, two police officers in a patrol car pulled up beside her. They didn't seem to be in a rush or responding to an emergency. They simply stopped right next to Ms. Linda. She paused, wondering what was going on. It wasn't unusual for police officers to patrol the area, but this time, something felt different. One of the officers, a young man with a serious expression, rolled down his window and looked at Ms. Linda. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice cold. "Can I ask you what you're doing here?" Ms. Linda was taken aback. She didn't understand why they were questioning her. "I'm just walking home," she replied, trying to stay calm. "I live a few blocks down." The officer didn't seem satisfied with her answer. "You look suspicious," he said. "We've had some reports about someone matching your description. I need to ask you a few questions." Ms. Linda felt a rush of nervousness in her chest. She was just a senior woman walking home from the store. Why was she being treated like a criminal? "I haven't done anything wrong," she said softly, her voice shaking a little. "I'm just going home." But the officer didn't listen. He got out of the car, and the second officer, a taller man with a gruff expression, also stepped out. They stood in front of Ms. Linda, blocking her path. She looked up at them, feeling small and helpless. The young officer crossed his arms, looking her over from head to toe, as if she were a suspect. "I'm not sure we believe you," the young officer said, his tone even colder now. "We need to check your identification." Ms. Linda's heart started to race. She had never been in a situation like this before. She was a law-abiding citizen, and she had never been involved with the police in any way. Why were they treating her like this? "Please, I don't have time for this," she said, her voice shaking. "I just need to get home." But the officers didn't listen. The taller officer moved closer to her, clearly not caring about her distress. He reached into her shopping bag, rummaging through her things without asking. Ms. Linda felt her stomach tighten in fear. What were they doing? Why were they treating her this way? She had done nothing wrong. "Are you carrying anything illegal?" the taller officer asked, his voice mocking. "No," Ms. Linda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a grandmother going home." The younger officer glared at her. "You think you can just walk around here without being questioned? This is not your neighborhood," he said, his words biting. Ms. Linda felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She was confused and scared. She had always felt safe in her neighborhood. This was her home, and she had never been treated like this before. The officers' attitudes made her feel like a criminal, even though she had done nothing wrong. For a moment, she thought about just walking away. She had no reason to stay and argue with them. But the taller officer stepped forward again, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice harsh. Ms. Linda froze, unable to speak. Her mind raced, but she didn't know what to do. She wanted to go home, but she couldn't get past these officers. The fear in her chest grew heavier with every passing second. She felt helpless, and that's when she decided she needed to do something. Ms. Linda knew that this situation had gone too far, and there was only one person who could help her. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands were trembling as she dialed the number she had memorized for years, the one person who could make all of this stop. The officers didn't notice what she was doing at first. They were too busy arguing among themselves about what to do next. But as Ms. Linda quietly pressed the phone to her ear, she knew that her son, the U.S. Attorney General, was the only person who could end this nightmare. Her son, James Williams was a powerful man in Washington. He had worked hard to get to where he was, and he had never forgotten his roots. Ms. Linda knew that if anyone could make these officers listen, it was him. And so, as the tension in the air grew, she waited for him to pick up the phone, praying that he would answer. The seconds felt like hours, but then, finally, her son's familiar voice came through. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked. Ms. Linda let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "James, I need you. The police. They're harassing me." Her voice broke, but she knew that with her son on the other end of the line, everything would change. Ms. Linda's hands were shaking as she held the phone to her ear. She could hear the familiar sound of her son's voice on the other end, calm and steady, but there was no mistaking the concern in it. He had always been there for her, whether she needed help with small things or big issues. But this was different. This was something far more serious. "Mom, is everything okay?" James's voice echoed in her ear. Ms. Linda's voice cracked, but she took a deep breath, trying to keep herself composed. "James, it's the police. They're here, harassing me. I don't know why, but they're treating me like I did something wrong." James paused for a moment on the other end, his thoughts racing. He knew the importance of staying calm. He had been in many tough situations before, but this one hit him hard. His mother, an elderly woman, was now being treated this way simply because of her race. He felt a surge of anger but controlled it. He had to be careful and act fast. "Mom, listen to me," James said, his voice firm yet reassuring. "Don't say anything more. Stay calm. I'm on my way. Just stay there and don't let them do anything to you. I'm going to handle this." Ms. Linda felt a sense of relief wash over her as she heard the confidence in her son's voice. She trusted him completely, knowing he would do whatever it took to protect her. I'll wait here," she whispered, her heart pounding. She looked at the officers who were still standing around her, but now their demeanor had changed slightly. They seemed less aggressive, though still not apologetic. James's voice came through the phone again. "I'm calling in a few people, Mom. I'm not going to let this slide. You've done nothing wrong. Just hold on, okay?" Ms. Linda nodded, though he couldn't see her. She gripped the phone tightly, still feeling the anxiety bubbling inside her, but her son's words gave her strength. She knew he would take care of everything. After all, he was the U.S. Attorney General. No one could stop him. As she waited, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her. The police had always been a symbol of safety and authority in her mind. But now, they seemed to be the very thing she needed protection from. It was an unsettling feeling, one that made her feel powerless in a situation that was completely unjust. The officers didn't move. They continued to stand around, casting occasional glances at Ms. Linda, their expressions still stern. But the silence between them seemed to grow thicker. They no longer seemed as confident as they had when they first approached her. It was as though they were beginning to realize that they might have made a mistake. And then, just as Ms. Linda was beginning to think that nothing was happening fast enough, she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. Her son was on his way, and she knew this situation was about to take a dramatic turn. The officers looked at each other, confusion flashing across their faces. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. The sirens grew louder, and soon, a sleek black SUV pulled up next to Ms. Linda. The officers immediately tensed, clearly uncertain about what was happening. Out stepped a tall, confident man in a sharp suit. It was James Williams. Ms. Linda's son had arrived, and the entire atmosphere shifted. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now looked almost nervous. The sight of James, U.S. Attorney General James Williams, was enough to make them pause and question their actions. "Is there a problem here?" James's voice rang out as he approached his mother, standing tall and strong. His presence alone made the officers step back. They all knew who he was. He had worked his way up through the legal system, earning respect and authority. And now he was here to make sure his mother was treated fairly. One of the officers spoke up, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Sir, we were just questioning this woman." James cut him off, his voice unwavering. "Questioning? You're harassing my mother, and you know it." He turned to Ms. Linda, his tone softening. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine now, James," she replied, her voice steadier than it had been when she first called him. But inside, she was still shaken, still processing everything that had just happened. She had trusted the police to protect her, and now they were the ones who had made her feel afraid. James turned back to the officers, his anger now visible. "You should have never treated her like this. She hasn't done anything wrong. You have no right to question her or invade her privacy." The officers exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the air was palpable. They had never expected someone like James Williams to show up. This wasn't just any ordinary citizen. This was the U.S. Attorney General. Their actions were now under intense scrutiny, and they knew it. Ms. Linda watched as her son stood tall, confronting the officers with authority. She felt a sense of pride wash over her. James was the kind of man who stood up for what was right, no matter the consequences. He was her son, and he was going to make sure no one got away with treating her like this. But as the officers stood there, realizing they were out of their depth, Ms. Linda could only wonder what would happen next. Would they finally understand the gravity of the situation? Would they face any consequences for their actions? The suspense hung thick in the air as James's voice rang out, his next words a promise. "This isn't over." The tension in the air was almost unbearable as James stood there, staring down the officers with a cold, unwavering gaze. His presence seemed to completely change the energy of the situation. The officers, once so confident in their authority, now appeared unsure of themselves, glancing nervously at each other. "Is this how you treat people in this neighborhood?" James's voice was sharp, cutting through the uneasy silence. "You've harassed my mother for no reason, and I'm not going to let this slide." Ms. Linda stood to the side, her heart still racing. She had never seen her son so fierce. James had always been kind, caring, and patient, but now there was a fire in him that she had never seen before. He was the U.S. Attorney General, and he had the power to change everything in an instant. One of the officers, the younger one who had first approached Ms. Linda, tried to defend his actions. "Sir, we were just following standard procedure. We had a report." "A report?" James interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "So, because of some vague report, you think it's acceptable to treat an elderly woman like a criminal? You think that's standard procedure?" The officer stumbled over his words, clearly realizing that his excuse wasn't going to work. "We were just doing our job. We thought she looked suspicious." James's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious? Are you serious? She's a grandmother, walking down the street with her groceries. You had no reason to stop her, no reason to question her, and certainly no reason to search her. What exactly were you looking for?" The officer couldn't respond. His face reddened with embarrassment, and he shifted uncomfortably under James's stare. The other officers remained silent, not daring to speak up, clearly understanding the seriousness of the situation. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't just any encounter. They had made a grave mistake, and now they would have to answer for it. James turned to Ms. Linda, his voice softening. "Mom, are you okay?" Ms. Linda nodded, though her hand still trembled slightly. "I'm okay now, James. I don't understand why they treated me like that. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, Mom," James said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But don't worry. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." He turned back to the officers, his voice cold once more. "You will be held accountable for your actions. I'm going to make sure of it." The officers looked at each other nervously, realizing that the situation was escalating quickly. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was a violation of Ms. Linda's rights, and it would not go unnoticed. James took a deep breath, then pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, his voice calm but firm as he spoke into the phone. "I need to report an incident involving two officers harassing an elderly woman on the street. They had no probable cause to stop her, and their actions were completely unjustified. I need this to be looked into immediately." The officers stood there, their faces pale, knowing that this was the moment everything would change. They had underestimated Ms. Linda and her son, thinking they could get away with their actions, but now, the full weight of James's authority was coming down on them. Ms. Linda couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her son was calling in the situation, making sure the right people knew what had happened. He was going to make sure the officers would face consequences. The sense of powerlessness she had felt just moments before was slowly starting to fade. James was taking control, and she knew things would be different now. As James ended the call, he turned back to the officers. "You've messed with the wrong people. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else again." For a moment, there was complete silence. The officers stood still, realizing they had no way out of this. The truth was undeniable. They had wrongfully targeted an innocent woman, and now they were going to have to face the consequences of their actions. James's voice broke the silence, this time more measured but just as firm. "I want your badge numbers, and I want a full report of what happened here today." One of the officers reluctantly gave his badge number, and the other followed suit. James took a mental note of everything, knowing that this would not be the end. He would make sure that these officers would be held accountable, no matter what. Ms. Linda looked at her son, a sense of relief flooding her chest. She had always known that James would protect her. But now, as the situation began to settle, she realized that he wasn't just protecting her. He was making sure that something like this would never happen to anyone else again. The officers slowly began to back away, clearly realizing they had lost control of the situation. James stood tall, watching them until they were out of sight. Only then did he turn back to his mother. "Let's go home, Mom," James said softly. "You've been through enough." Ms. Linda smiled weakly, finally feeling the weight of the day lifting off her shoulders. "Thank you, James. I don't know what I would have done without you." James nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "You never have to face anything like this alone, Mom. I'll always be here." As they walked away from the scene, the officers' faces still fresh in her mind, Ms. Linda knew that things would never be the same. She had faced fear and uncertainty that day, but in the end, her son's strength and determination had brought her through it, and she would never forget that. But as the two of them left, Ms. Linda couldn't help but wonder how many others had been treated the same way she had, without someone to stand up for them. The following morning, things had quieted down, but the ripple effects of the previous day's events were just beginning to spread. James had already started making calls to ensure the investigation into the officers' actions was moving forward. He was determined to hold them accountable, but he knew that was only the beginning. The whole system had to change, and he would be the one to make sure it did. Ms. Linda sat in her living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her mind kept returning to the incident. She couldn't shake the feeling of injustice, of the way the officers had looked at her with such disregard. It wasn't just about what they did. It was about everything that had led up to it. She had been treated as though she was invisible, as though her life didn't matter. But that wasn't the case anymore. James had made sure of that. He was on the case now, and things were going to change. Suddenly, her phone rang. She didn't need to check the number. She knew who it was. James had promised to keep her in the loop. She picked up the phone, her voice steady but anxious. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to give you an update," James said, his voice calm as always, but she could hear the urgency beneath it. "The investigation is already underway. Internal Affairs is looking into the officers involved, and I've made sure they're being questioned. But there's something else." Ms. Linda sat up straighter, her curiosity piqued. "What is it, James?" I've been speaking to a few other people, including some contacts at the police department, and it turns out this isn't the first time these officers have acted like this. James continued. There's a pattern. They've had previous complaints filed against them for similar behavior, but nothing ever came of it. Now, with this incident, we have enough evidence to push for a full review of their conduct. Ms. Linda's heart skipped a beat. So, this isn't just about me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. No, Mom. This is much bigger than that, James replied. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, and we're going to make sure that these officers face the consequences for their actions. They can't keep getting away with it. Ms. Linda took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling on her. The officers hadn't just wronged her. They had been operating with impunity for a long time, treating others the same way. She couldn't imagine how many people had suffered in silence, just like she had, without anyone stepping up to make a difference. I'm proud of you, James, she said quietly. You're doing the right thing. James paused for a moment before responding. I don't just want to fix this for you, Mom. I want to fix this for everyone who's been wronged by these officers. I want to make sure people know that no one, no matter who they are, should be treated like this. Ms. Linda felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with something else. A deep, burning determination. She had been wronged, but now she could see that change was possible. James wasn't just a son looking out for his mother. He was a man determined to right the wrongs of the system. I just want to make sure this never happens to anyone else, Ms. Linda said, her voice thick with emotion. No one should ever have to go through what I did yesterday. James's voice softened. And we'll make sure they don't. I promise. As they hung up, Ms. Linda felt a quiet hope rising within her. It wasn't just about her. It was about justice for everyone. And she wasn't going to let the incident fade into the background. She would stand by her son, and together they would make sure that the system changed for good. The days that followed were filled with meetings, investigations, and legal steps. James kept his word, pushing for accountability at every turn. Internal affairs dug deep, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that was shocking, even to those who had been following the case. But it wasn't just the officers involved who were under scrutiny now. It was the entire department, the way things had been done for years. News of the incident spread, and it didn't take long before people began to rally behind James and his mother. Protests and rallies were organized, calling for justice and demanding that the police department be held accountable. What had started as one woman's story was now the rallying cry for many others who had experienced the same kind of injustice. For Ms. Linda, the sight of people coming together, standing up for what was right, was overwhelming. She never thought that her quiet life would become a symbol for something so much bigger. She had felt powerless in that moment with the officers, but now she felt empowered by the movement her son had helped create. In the midst of it all, James remained calm, focused, and unwavering in his resolve. He knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning he was willing to fight for. He had promised his mother justice, and he would stop at nothing to deliver it. As the investigation continued, the officers involved were placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the review. They knew their actions were being scrutinized, but that didn't stop them from trying to defend their behavior. The public, however, was unforgiving. The tide had turned, and the officers were on the defensive. For Ms. Linda, the next few days were filled with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She had always been a quiet, peaceful woman, but now she had a voice. Thanks to her son and the people who stood with them, she was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was part of something bigger, part of a movement that was working to make sure no one else had to face what she did. But the real change had only just begun. As the days passed, the story of Ms. Linda's encounter with the officers spread like wildfire. News outlets covered the investigation, and social media exploded with reactions. The public was furious, not just about what had happened to Ms. Linda, but about the broader issue of police misconduct and racial inequality. It was a moment that seemed to capture the frustrations of many, a tipping point in a much larger conversation. Protests erupted in major cities across the country, demanding justice for Ms. Linda and others who had been victims of police abuse. Signs reading "Justice for Linda" and "End Police Brutality" appeared everywhere. The movement had gained traction, and people were rallying behind the idea that change was needed. For once, the voices of the marginalized were being heard, loud and clear. Ms. Linda watched the events unfold on her television, her heart heavy with emotion. She had never imagined her life would become a focal point for a national movement. But here she was, her name on the lips of thousands of people who were demanding justice. She was grateful for the support, but it was hard to ignore the weight of the responsibility that had suddenly been placed on her shoulders. James, on the other hand, felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. He had known that the case would gain attention, but the overwhelming public outcry was both validating and sobering. As the U.S. Attorney General, he had the power to effect change, but he also knew that change wouldn't come easily. The road ahead would be long, filled with legal battles, public pressure, and, no doubt, resistance from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But he was ready for it. One evening, James sat down with his mother in the living room, both of them watching the latest news report. The anchor spoke about the protests, the rallies, and the growing calls for the officers involved to be fired and charged. There was a sense of momentum now, but James knew the real challenge was still ahead. "This is bigger than just us, Mom," James said quietly, his eyes focused on the screen. "It's about everyone who's been treated unfairly, everyone who's been targeted for no reason other than the color of their skin." Ms. Linda nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in. "I never thought it would get this big," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad people are speaking out. I'm glad they're fighting for justice." James turned to her, his face serious. "I know this isn't easy for you, Mom, but you've already done something incredible. Your story has inspired so many people. You're giving them the courage to stand up for themselves." Ms. Linda smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I never wanted to be a symbol, James. I just wanted to live my life in peace. But if this is what it takes to make things change, then I'll do it." The next day, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. Public outcry was growing stronger with every passing hour. The department had no choice but to act. The officers involved in the incident with Ms. Linda were placed under investigation, and their actions were scrutinized by both internal affairs and the public. It was clear that the department had no choice but to take a stand. Meanwhile, James's office was flooded with calls. Lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and even celebrities were offering their support. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how James would handle the situation. It was a moment that could define his career, but more importantly, it was a moment that could define the future of policing in the country. James took a deep breath as he sat down at his desk, his mind racing with everything that needed to be done. He had to make sure that this moment wasn't just a flash in the pan, that it led to real, lasting change. He drafted a speech, one that would be delivered at a press conference the following week. It was a speech he hoped would set the tone for the next phase of the movement. Speech draft excerpt. "The actions of a few officers cannot define the entire law enforcement community, but they do expose the deep flaws that exist within our system. We cannot continue to ignore the reality that too many people, especially people of color, are being treated unjustly. Too many lives have been disrupted, destroyed, or lost due to systemic issues that have gone unaddressed for far too long." This moment is not just about one incident. This is about a nation that is tired of living in fear, tired of being silenced, tired of being invisible. It's time for accountability. It's time for reform. And it's time for us to stand together and demand justice for every person in every community across this country. The speech was powerful, but James knew it was just the beginning. It was a call to action, but action would require more than words. It would require policy changes, reform, and a collective effort to make sure this moment was not forgotten. But for now, he focused on the next step, getting justice for his mother and for everyone who had suffered at the hands of the police. The investigation would continue, and James wouldn't rest until the officers involved were held accountable. The momentum was building, and he was ready to push forward, no matter the obstacles. The day after James delivered his speech, the tension in the air felt almost palpable. The calls for justice had grown louder, and now the legal wheels were turning. It wasn't just about public opinion anymore. It was about holding the officers accountable in the court of law. And that would be a much tougher fight. The justice system had its own complexities, and James knew it would take every ounce of his determination to bring about real change. James's office had already begun compiling the evidence. The video footage from the incident was being analyzed by experts, and the testimonies of witnesses were being collected. Every piece of information mattered. The stakes were high, and James couldn't afford to lose focus. The pressure was immense, but he had never backed down from a challenge before. He wasn't about to start now. Ms. Linda had been following every development closely. She had never thought of herself as a fighter, but now she was finding herself in the middle of a battle for justice, one that was bigger than she had ever imagined. She knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but she also knew that this was the only way to make sure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else again. James sat with his team of attorneys late one evening, reviewing the strategy for the case. The room was filled with a sense of urgency. There was no time to waste. The case needed to be solid, and every argument had to be bulletproof. The attorneys were seasoned, but even they understood the gravity of what they were about to undertake. "This isn't just about wrongful arrest," one of the senior attorneys, Mark, said as he flipped through the legal documents. "This is about systemic abuse of power. We need to show the court that this isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a larger pattern. We need to prove that these officers acted with bias, that their actions weren't just an error in judgment, but a reflection of a deeper institutional problem." James nodded. "I agree. We have to show that this was not just about my mom. It's about every person who's been wronged by this system. We need to prove that these officers thought they could get away with it because they've done it before." The attorneys exchanged glances. Mark was right. The case wasn't just about securing justice for Ms. Linda. It was about bringing attention to the broader issue of racial profiling and police brutality. This case had the potential to expose a system that had been protecting abusive officers for far too long. But it would take careful work, and James was prepared to do whatever it took. As the legal team worked tirelessly, Ms. Linda sat quietly at home, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had never imagined her life would be part of something so public, so widespread. She had simply wanted to go about her day, to live without fear. But now she had become a symbol of resistance, and while she was proud of the movement she had helped ignite, she couldn't deny the toll it was taking on her. James noticed the change in her. He knew his mother was a strong woman, but the weight of the situation was wearing her down. She had always been there for him, but now it was his turn to take care of her. One evening, after a long day of work, James stopped by his mother's house. He could tell she was tired. The lines of worry etched deep into her face. But she tried to smile as he walked in, putting down the papers she had been reading. "How are you holding up, Mom?" James asked, sitting down beside her. Ms. Linda sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm doing okay, James. I just didn't think it would be like this. I didn't expect my life to be so public. But I understand why we're doing it. It's just hard sometimes." James placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. "I know, Mom. It's not easy, but we're doing the right thing. You're doing the right thing. This is bigger than us. We're making a difference." Ms. Linda nodded slowly, though she didn't fully believe the words yet. It was hard to see the bigger picture when she had been so directly impacted. But she trusted her son, and she knew that he was fighting for what was right. She would stand by him, no matter how hard it got. Meanwhile, the investigation into the officers continued. Internal Affairs had been working overtime to dig into their history, uncovering more and more instances of misconduct. The public pressure was undeniable. The department knew that if they didn't act quickly, they would risk losing control of the situation entirely. Finally, after weeks of intense scrutiny, the officers involved were brought in for questioning. The room was tense, filled with anticipation as the investigators prepared to confront them with the evidence. "Tell us why you thought it was acceptable to treat Ms. Linda the way you did," one of the investigators asked, his voice calm but firm. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing that the tables had turned. They had long assumed they were untouchable, but now the truth was beginning to surface. It was clear that they had underestimated the power of the movement, and they were starting to realize that the consequences for their actions would be far greater than they had ever imagined. After months of legal battles, media attention, and public outcry, the case was finally set for trial. The entire nation seemed to be watching, with many hoping for a resolution that would bring justice to Ms. Linda and shed light on the deeper issues within the police force. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides prepared for the final showdown. James sat in the front row, his face a mask of concentration. He had seen his share of tough cases, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It was about delivering justice for his mother and for everyone who had been wronged by the system. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing documents, meeting with the prosecution team, and preparing his closing statements. There was no room for error. Ms. Linda sat beside him, still overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. She had never imagined being part of something so monumental. She had only wanted to live a peaceful life. But now, she was at the center of a movement that could change the course of history. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap as she watched the courtroom door, waiting for the trial to begin. It was a feeling of uncertainty, but also of hope. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose to their feet. As the proceedings began, the prosecution team laid out the evidence, showing that the officers involved had acted not only illegally, but with clear racial bias. They presented testimony from witnesses, expert analysis of the video footage, and the troubling history of the officers involved in other incidents of misconduct. It was a compelling case, and James was confident that they had the proof they needed. On the other side, the defense tried to argue that the officers had acted in good faith, believing that Ms. Linda was involved in a crime. But it was clear to everyone that the real issue was racial profiling. The officers had made assumptions based on nothing more than Ms. Linda's appearance, and that was the heart of the matter. As the trial continued, the media coverage became even more intense. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and the public's attention was unwavering. Protests continued outside the courthouse, with people chanting for justice and demanding accountability. The momentum for change was undeniable. Then, after days of arguments, it was time for the closing statements. James stood before the judge and the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," James began, "this case is about more than just one wrongful arrest. It's about a system that allows people to be treated unjustly simply because of the color of their skin. It's about the countless people who have been racially profiled, mistreated, and wronged by those who are meant to protect them. My mother did nothing wrong that day. She was targeted simply because of who she is. And that is not acceptable." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. Justice is not just about punishing those who have done wrong. It's about ensuring that what happened to my mother never happens again. It's about creating a system where every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, is treated with respect and dignity. James looked directly at the jury, his gaze unwavering. "I ask you to consider the evidence carefully. I ask you to think about the bigger picture. This is about the future of our society. This is about making sure that no one ever has to experience what my mother went through. And I ask you to hold these officers accountable." The room was silent as James finished. His words had struck a chord with everyone in the room. Ms. Linda, sitting in the front row, felt a surge of emotion. She had never expected to be part of something so powerful, but now she was watching history unfold right before her eyes. Her son had given everything to make sure that the truth was heard. The defense made their final argument, but it was clear that the case was no longer in their favor. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours, but finally, they returned with a verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the foreman stood to announce the decision. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of unlawful arrest and racial profiling. The room erupted into applause. People cheered, and many in the courtroom couldn't hold back tears. It was a victory not just for Ms. Linda, but for everyone who had been fighting for justice. The officers involved were immediately fired, and charges were filed against them. It was a monumental moment, one that would send ripples through the entire justice system. As James and Ms. Linda stood up, the weight of the moment settled over them. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of relief. The battle had been long, but it was finally over. The victory was sweet, but they both knew that the fight for justice was far from finished. The system had been exposed for its flaws, and now it was up to the people to continue pushing for change. In the days that followed, the news continued to cover the story. The trial had sparked conversations about police reform, racial justice, and the need for accountability. People were talking, and more importantly, they were listening. The victory was more than just a legal win. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. For Ms. Linda, it was a bittersweet moment. She had fought for justice, and she had won, but the scars of that day would never fully fade. Yet she could take comfort in knowing that her story had made a difference. And for James, the fight was far from over. As the U.S. Attorney General, he would continue to lead the charge for change, knowing that there was still much work to be done. Together, they had brought about a small but significant victory, and together, they would continue to fight for a future where justice was truly for all.